He divided his time between large-scale religious works destined for public places and those for private collectors, like portraits and more erotically charged images. This is Flora, painted around 1520, an example of a courtesan portrait, and which it's thought the patron commissioned for his bedroom. This type of image had become increasingly popular in 16th century Venice. Titian often used the female form to supply his wealthy patrons with pictures which subtly allude to sexual love. The paintings were often hung behind curtains or in private quarters and shown off only to select male visitors. The woman is supposedly Flora, a legendary figure from ancient Roman festivals, known as both a courtesan and a goddess. Courtesans were high-class prostitutes, well-versed in poetry, literature and music. The demand for both ordinary prostitutes and courtesans must have been extremely high. In a city of around 125,000 people, there were nearly 12,000 of them, a growing service industry for the tradesmen, sailors and tourists who flocked to the sensual city. By his early 30s, Titian was well established as the leading Venetian artist, and he'd also begun to attract attention from patrons further afield. The countryside around Venice was made up of duchies and home to a number of wealthy families who were central to the development of Renaissance art, being the main source of commissions for poets and painters. Titian became extremely popular with two powerful Renaissance families, the Gonzagas of Mantua and the d'Este family from Ferrara. The Duke of Ferrara commissioned Titian to paint a series of works for his study, and the Venetian responded with 3 large, luscious mythological scenes devoted to orgiastic feasts and falling in love. And this is one of the 3 pictures that Titian made for the Duke of Ferrara. Joyful, exuberant, slightly crazy. It tells the story of Bacchus and Ariadne, and it's a narrative painting full of detail, full of life, full of energy. And what Titian is doing is taking one of the traditional subjects in the history of art, mythology, but totally revitalizing it. The scene is set on the Greek island of Naxos, where Ariadne here has just woken up to find that her lover, Theseus, has deserted her. Having solicited her help to kill the Minotaur, he then leaves her, and Titian alludes to that by showing a ship there in the distance, sailing off over the horizon line, and that really is the symbol of her lost love. But in turn, the god, Bacchus, the god of wine and inspiration, appears to try and seduce Ariadne, or indeed to cast her off. So she's just woken up, she's just seen love lost, she's also then startled by this handsome young god, but with his lunatic entourage. And this is the entourage of Bacchanalian frenzy. They're drunks. You can see a guy drunk on an ass there in the background, another carrying a barrel, and another holding above his head the leg with the hoof of a cow that they've just torn in this kind of frenzy, with a head here in the foreground. The painting is filled with symbols. Look up in the sky. There's a constellation of stars set against this deep azure blue sky when it seems to be the middle of the day. Now, the symbol of that is clear. When eventually Bacchus and Ariadne married, he gave her a diadem, a jeweled crown or headpiece for the wedding present, which in turn, later on in the mythological story, becomes a constellation of stars. And there it is above her head as a kind of symbol of the union, a wedding ring if you like, between these 2 figures. When you first look at this picture, there are 2 overriding characteristics that you notice, and it's those that give the picture its real strength. The first is colour. Titian, even at this early stage in his career, is a masterful colourist. These wonderful deep blues, sometimes heightened by their complementary orange, sometimes made to sing against the red or the green. And there's always a fantastic sense of colour balance. And in fact, this painting looks as if it's lit from behind. It has a graphic and striking sense of luminosity. And the second characteristic is the frozen moment. It's as if the most wild party has suddenly been stopped by the press of a pause button on a video. This is one of the great suspended frozen moments in Titian's career. And it's because of this that Titian is able to reinvigorate this subject. There are thousands of mythological paintings in the history of art, but there are very few that are as visually energetic as this one. By the time Titian had completed the commission for the Duke's study, he was in his mid-30s. Due to his shrewd business sense and the prodigious output of his studio, he'd by now amassed considerable wealth. But not everything was flourishing. Tragedy struck in his personal life. His wife Cecilia died in 1530. Certain scholars believe that Cecilia was used as a model in some of Titian's works, not least this one, the Madonna and Rabbit, thought to be painted around the time that she died. But it's a view that's perhaps a bit more romantic than based on any fact. Shortly after the death of his wife, he moved with his children to a large house in one of Venice's more refined districts. Here he lived the life of a distinguished Venetian gentleman and entertained the city's most illustrious men and women. He was at the height of his success when he came to the attention of his most prestigious patron yet. In 1530, Titian went to Bologna to attend the coronation of Charles V, and he was introduced to the new Holy Roman Emperor, who at that time was the most powerful man in the world. As Holy Roman Emperor, he effectively ruled throughout Central Europe, and as King of Spain, he ruled territories in the Spanish Netherlands, as well as numerous places in the New World. He commissioned Titian to paint a portrait immediately, and that's now lost. But 3 years later, Titian began a succession of royal portraits, of which this is the most impressive and important. Unusually, it's a full-length image of the emperor, who stands before us with a suggestion of calm, strong authority. When you get close up, the brushstrokes are feathery. Move away, though, and the image crystallizes. Likewise, Charles emerges out of the darkness behind into the light. The painting was a great success for Titian. He was immediately invited to become a court painter and join the Order of the Golden Spur, which gave him rights as a courtier. In effect, he was becoming part of an important imperial propaganda machine, where, in an age before photography, the portraits of the emperor were an extension of his rule in places where he himself hadn't been. In turn, for Titian, it made him the most sought-after painter in the West, an artist who could pick and choose his commissions rather than depend on the will of others. Titian's client list was reading like a who's who of mid-16th century Europe. As well as his associations with Charles V and regular visits to the Gonzaga court in Mantua, Titian also devoted time to another important dynastic family, the Della Roveres of Urbino. This is one of the more famous pictures in the history of Western art. It's called the Venus of Urbino because it was acquired by a man who became the Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo della Rovere. It's an image of wonderfully sensual eroticism, glazed with a classical veneer. She's called Venus, but she's every woman in a way. A beautiful figure, lying on a bed, covering up her genitals, but at the same time enticing our gaze there, but returning our gaze with a vengeance as she stares back nonchalantly at us. Guidobaldo had got married 4 years before, in 1534, to a child bride. The dog is a symbol of marital fidelity. The roses that she holds is a symbol of the pleasure of love, but also the constancy of love, as is the myrtle plant in the background visible against the window. The servants seem to be showing how you run a steady household. So on one level, this picture is almost a manual for a young woman learning to be a dutiful wife. But it's an image that begins and ends with flesh. And in fact, Titian is pioneering a new way of painting human flesh that involves slow-drying oils, that he applies in thinned layers almost to the point of translucency, and he builds up the flesh rather in the way that human flesh is made in layers. And there's this eroticism that seems to burgeon from this work, and in fact it heralds a new style of painting. This is for private eyes as well as a manual for a young woman to learn how to be a good wife. And in that respect it becomes a landmark in the history of erotic art. And it's a picture that is reinvented and reinterpreted and obsesses artists as great as Goya, Manet, Picasso, and onwards. In 1545, in his mid-50s, Titian visited Rome, invited by the grandson of Pope Paul III. He stayed in an apartment overlooking the Vatican. In a letter to Charles V, he wrote of his interest in the city's numerous classical monuments, saying, "I am learning from these marvellous ancient stones." But the primary purpose of the trip was patronage, and he painted portraits of the Farnese family, whose members included cardinals and the Pope himself. In 1555, Charles V abdicated, and his son Philip II inherited the title of King of Spain. Titian found Philip to be as powerful and sympathetic a patron as his father had been, and produced some of the most dramatic and ambitious work of his life. Philip initially commissioned Titian to paint 2 large mythological scenes, which became part of an epic series, perhaps the most striking of which is this one, called Diana and Callisto, held in the National Gallery of Scotland. The subject matter is classical. Titian called these his poesies, poems that were otherworldly and also erotic. And it tells the story of Diana. She's the goddess of hunting. She's also the moon goddess. And one day, she and her merry band of huntresses have been out, and they come back and they discover that something is not quite right with one of them, the figure lying here being stripped by her fellow huntresses. That's Callisto. And what had happened previously is that she'd been raped by Jupiter, chief of the gods, and she was pregnant. Now, chastity was valued above all else in this gathering of women. And when it was suspected that she might be pregnant, she stripped open, and this is that moment of revelation. What happens subsequently in the story is rather tragic. Callisto is cast out of the group. In turn, when Jupiter's wife, Juno, hears about what's happened, she banishes Callisto and turns her into a bear. In turn, the child that's in Callisto's stomach at this moment, Arca, her son, sees the bear, pursues what turns out to be his mother, but he doesn't know that, kills her. But in kind of recompense, Jupiter discovers all of this and turns Callisto into Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, a constellation of stars in the sky. And Titian acknowledges that part of the saga implicitly, because look at the action. It moves from Diana to Callisto. Diana is pointing an admonishment. Go, you're out. It's that moment of revelation. But our eyes, through this snaking water, are taken back and round to the forest, where Callisto will end up shortly. And then finally, we're taken off into the sky itself, where she'll also end up. The sky is also the dominant color area of the whole painting. It's that wonderful orange glow, balanced by the blueness of the hills that you find rhymes of all over the painting. Orange and blue are complementary colors, and it's color that really excites Titian. He turns paint itself into something like flesh. He used to smear it on with brushes and his fingers. And as he gets older, and he's in his 70s when he paints this, everything is starting to lighten up. What's most noticeable about these works is their rough and almost unfinished nature, most evident in the last in the series, The Death of Actaeon, in which line is almost non-existent. It also supports the idea that in his later years, Titian painted as much with his fingers as he did with his brush. The elderly Titian's final years saw him continue to paint prolifically with works defined by a dramatic intensity in an increasingly loose and liberated style. An acute awareness of impending death seems blatant in the last painting, Pietà, on which Titian was working in 1576, when Venice was ravaged by yet another gruesome plague. Titian died on the 27th of August of that year, although not actually of the plague, but it got his son soon afterwards, along with nearly 70,000 Venetians. And so Titian was buried in the splendid Frari church, surrounded by 2 of his most accomplished masterpieces. Titian was the brightest star in the dazzling firmament of 16th century Venice, whose use of colour and light transformed European art, and whose physical expressiveness began a revolution in painting. His work was sought and owned by many of the most powerful people in his world. making him perhaps the first truly international artist.